In the spring in 1973, Willie Stargell stood in front of a room full of reporters and said something he had never revealed before. He was not a man who searched for headlines. For 13 years he had let his bat speak for him, season after season, while reporters across the country crowded around his locker asking about home runs and pennant races. But that day he looked at the men in front of him and told them, plainly, they had spent a decade getting something wrong about the man who had once stood next to him in the clubhouse. Roberto Clemente was gone, and Stargell had waited until he could no longer defend himself to finally say it out loud. Roberto Clemente grew up in Carolina, Puerto Rico, in a small house near the sugarcane fields where his father worked as a foreman. There was no money to buy a real glove, so he learned to field ground balls barehanded on the dirt roads near his home, scooping up rocks and broken glass along with the ball without ever flinching. In 1954, a Puerto Rican teenager who spoke broken English, who had never set foot on the mainland United States, had almost no realistic path into American baseball, let alone a path leading to the clubhouse of a major league within a single year. He signed with the Brooklyn Dodgers for a $10,000 bonus, a number the Dodgers tried to keep hidden, because the rules of that era would have forced them to expose any high bonus player to selection by other teams. But someone found out. The Pittsburgh Pirates picked him off Brooklyn's roster through an obscure procedural rule that few people knew about. A rule written precisely for cases overlooked like this one. Brooklyn barely noticed the loss at the time. Pittsburgh, in 1955, was one of the worst teams in baseball, a club that had finished last or near last for years, and no one in that organization believed a 20-year-old outfielder from Carolina would change who they were. He was quiet through his first seasons, watching more than speaking, still learning to adapt to the rhythm of a clubhouse and a language that were not his own. The scouts who watched him during batting practice noticed something the box scores could not yet show, a throw from right field that looked entirely different from the arms around him, a snap that seemed to cut through the air in a different way. He also carried a back injury from a car accident in Puerto Rico, an injury the team doctors of that time could not fully diagnose with the tools available to them, and that injury would quietly follow him through nearly every season of his career without ever being properly understood by the people writing about him. No one wrote about either of these two things in those early years. Not yet. The country had not yet learned to spell his name correctly in the papers. For most of the 1960s, the men covering baseball in newspapers across the country wrote about Roberto Clemente in a particular and recurring way. He was described as moody, as difficult to interview, as a man who complained too often about minor injuries that other players supposedly played through without comment. These were not invented words pulled from rumor. They appeared in print, season after season, written by reporters who carried every credential needed to be believed by the public, reading them at breakfast. Their case had a kind of internal logic that made sense at the time. In an era when ball players were expected to grind through pain in total silence, when toughness was measured by what a man refused to mention, Clemente spoke openly about his back, his elbow, the headaches that lingered after a collision at the plate. To men who treated silence as the proof of character, that honesty read as weakness, or worse, as theater meant to draw attention. What those writers missed was the difference between a man asking for sympathy and a man refusing to let an injury vanish from the record before it could be used against him later. Clemente was not asking anyone to feel sorry for him. He was making certain that nobody could quietly claim, years afterward, that he had been less than what he actually was during a season when his body was failing him. The writers heard complaint. They were actually listening to a man protecting the truth about his own body because he understood, long before most players around him did, exactly how easily a black, Spanish-speaking athlete could be erased from his own story by people who controlled the only version that got printed. For 10 years, that misreading followed him through MVP ballots he should have won and rarely did, through profiles that focused on his temperament instead of his game. But inside the clubhouse, far from the typewriters, one young teammate was watching something the writers never once thought to look for. Willie Stargell arrived in Pittsburgh in 1962, a young black outfielder from a small town in Georgia, stepping for the first time into spring training towns across the South where hotels and restaurants still openly refused to serve him. Clemente had already lived through several years of those same towns, those same doors that would not open. He never called a meeting about it. He never raised his voice or demanded the front office intervene. What he did instead was simpler and far less visible. He found out which restaurants in each town would serve the Black and Latin players together, and he quietly made sure the team ate there as a group, never framing it as a protest or a public stand. He sat with the youngest players on long overnight bus rides and translated in both directions whenever language or fear kept someone from speaking up for himself. None of it ever appeared in a single newspaper column, because none of it was performed for anyone watching. Stargell, decades later, would say that he learned how to survive in that league because Clemente had already shown him what survival looked like before anyone bothered to explain it in words. He was not protected by one famous gesture that made the papers. He was protected by a man who had quietly decided, years earlier, that no rookie wearing his uniform would have to figure any of it out completely alone. Have you ever had someone look out for you without ever once announcing it? Someone whose protection you only understood much later in life? Tell us about that person in the comments below. In the late 1960s, an advertising company approached Clemente with a lucrative endorsement deal, the kind of contract that could have meaningfully changed his finances at a time when even star players still needed winter jobs to cover the months between seasons. There was one small condition buried in the paperwork. They wanted his name printed across the advertisement as Bob Clemente, a version they believed American audiences would find easier to pronounce and remember on a billboard. He turned the offer down without much discussion at all. His name was Roberto. It was the name his mother had given him in Carolina, the name printed on his birth certificate, the name that belonged to him before any company decided it needed editing for someone else's comfort. He saw no reason a paycheck should require erasing the one thing about himself that was entirely his own. There was another habit almost nobody outside the clubhouse ever knew about. Each morning, often before most of his teammates were even awake, Clemente sat alone with a cup of coffee and read through both the English-language newspapers and the Spanish-language papers shipped in from Puerto Rico, comparing line by line how each one chose to describe him that week. He rarely complained out loud about what he found there. He simply kept reading, year after year, marking certain pages in his own mind, as if refusing to let a single mischaracterization pass without his own private notice of it. Teammates who walked past him in those early morning hours assumed he was simply quiet by nature. Few of them understood he was quietly building his own record of the record being written about him. Before Pittsburgh's deciding game of the 1971 World Series, in a clubhouse full of nervous young players who had never experienced anything close to the moment ahead of them, Clemente did not deliver a long speech to settle anyone's nerves. He walked past a few of them near their lockers, his cleats still untied, and said only that this was a game worth playing for something larger than any one of them standing there. 9 words, perhaps 10, spoken quietly and never repeated to a single reporter waiting outside that door. Stargell remembered them exactly, word for word, decades later, down to the tone Clemente used, while the writers who covered that entire series remembered almost nothing he said at all that day, because none of it had been said for them to hear. There was one more detail teammates rarely discussed publicly. After losses, while reporters chased quotes from whoever had hit the go-ahead run, Clemente often sat alone at his locker for several minutes before speaking to anyone, replaying the game silently before he allowed himself to talk about it. He treated defeat the way he treated his own body, as something to be examined honestly rather than performed. Stargell once said that watching Clemente lose taught him more about the man than watching him win 3,000 hits ever did, because there was nowhere left to hide inside a quiet locker room after a bad night, and Clemente never once tried to. That, more than any headline, was the version Stargell carried with him long after the cameras had gone home for good. By the end of his career, Roberto Clemente had collected exactly 3,000 hits, becoming only the 11th player in Major League history to reach that specific number. When he recorded it in September of 1972, against a Mets pitcher in front of a home crowd that rose to its feet long before the ball even landed safely in the outfield grass, there was no certainty he would ever need another official at bat in his career. He did not need one. It quietly became the final hit he would ever record. a fact nobody in that stadium that afternoon had any way of knowing yet. In the 1971 World Series against Baltimore, a series broadcast in color to a national television audience that, for many casual viewers, was seeing him play closely for the very first time, Clemente hit .414 across 7 games. He threw runners out from right field with a precision announcers genuinely struggled to describe in real time, his arm cutting down advances that looked, to everyone watching, entirely safe a half-second earlier. Orioles base runners who had spent an entire season testing every outfielder in the American League simply stopped trying to take the extra base against him by the 4th game, a kind of surrender that never appeared in any box score but was visible to anyone paying attention. For the first time, the country that had spent a decade reading about a supposedly difficult man finally got to watch, instead, a complete one. He won 12 consecutive Gold Gloves across his career, a number matched by almost no one who ever played his position before or since. He also led the National League in batting average 4 separate times, in 1961, 1964, 1965, and 1967. A level of consistency that, in any other player's record, would have been described constantly as dominant rather than occasionally as lucky. His career batting average settled at .317 across 18 seasons, a figure that placed him among a small handful of players from his entire era, regardless of position or league. And yet across those 18 full seasons, he was named Most Valuable Player exactly once, in 1966. Despite finishing in the top 10 of that same voting 8 separate times. In 4 of those years, he posted numbers that, by any reasonable statistical measure applied decades later, ranked among the best in the National League at his position. The same writers who praised his glove and his arm generously in their columns somehow could not bring themselves to place his name at the very top of a ballot more than a single time in nearly 2 decades of dominant play. Compare that to the way voters treated other outfielders of the same period, men with similar power numbers but fewer Gold Gloves and far less defensive value, who nonetheless found their names atop ballots more than once during careers that overlapped directly with his own. What seemed to be disputed, year after year without ever being stated outright, was whether a player like him deserved to be called the best player in the league more than a single time. Why does a player with numbers like that receive only one Most Valuable Player award across 18 seasons? Let us know what you think the real reason was, down in the comments. 4 days after recording his 3,000th career hit, Roberto Clemente's final season ended quietly with the close of the Pirates' playoff run. 2 months later, a massive earthquake struck Managua, Nicaragua, killing thousands of people and leaving much of the capital in ruins. Clemente organized relief flights almost immediately, using his own name, his own reputation, and a significant amount of his own money to gather supplies across Puerto Rico for the survivors. Then word reached him that earlier shipments had been quietly seized by corrupt officials near the airport before they ever reached the people who actually needed them. He had heard stories of supplies sitting in warehouses while families slept outside in the rubble, untouched by any of it. Nobody asked him to personally fix a problem of that size. He decided, without being asked by anyone, that he would fly out with the 4th shipment himself, to make absolutely certain it landed in the right hands this time. The plane that left San Juan late on the night of the 31st of December 1972 was an aging cargo aircraft, overloaded well beyond its rated capacity, flown by a crew that did not hold the certification the flight legally required. It went down into the ocean only moments after takeoff, just off the coast. His body was never recovered, despite weeks of searching along that stretch of water. No one can say with certainty exactly what happened in the final seconds before the plane struck the ocean, whether the overloaded cargo shifted suddenly, whether an engine failed without warning, whether there was even enough time for anyone aboard to understand what was happening to them. What is certain is that a man once dismissed in print as difficult chose, with nobody forcing his hand, to put himself on a flight that almost no one else around him was willing to take that night. This is why Willie Stargell stood in front of that room of reporters in the spring of 1973 and said exactly what he said. He was not delivering a polite tribute for the cameras. He was correcting a public record that 10 years of newspaper columns had gotten wrong, about a man who was never truly moody and never truly difficult, only honest in a sport that did not yet know what to do with that kind of honesty coming from someone who looked like him and sounded like him. History eventually sided with Stargell instead of the writers who had come before him. The same year Clemente died, baseball waived its standard 5-year waiting period entirely and inducted him into the Hall of Fame almost immediately, an honor extended, before and since, to almost no one else in the sport's long history. Sometimes the world calls a man stubborn simply for refusing to disappear quietly into someone else's flattened version of his own story. It often takes losing him completely for people to understand that he had been right all along, about all of it. If this story stayed with you, leave a like. It genuinely helps us keep telling the stories baseball almost let slip away. Drop a comment with the name of a player you believe history misjudged the way it misjudged Clemente. Share this with someone who loves the game as much as you do. And if you want to see the full story of Willie Stargell himself, that video is right after this one.